Today's interesting topic is wage differentials. It's not that long. There are some clips in it and some charts, so you don't need to take so many notes. One reason why people make different amounts of money is that they have different levels of human capital. So what is human capital? It's the accumulation of investment in people. And if you have more things invested in you, then your skills will increase, right? So you can pretty much say human capital is the same as skills, although it's a little bit more, and it's going to increase the productivity. So productivity means your rate of production, how fast you can make things. So one part of that is natural or hereditary, which means you're born with it, so like physical strength or beauty, and that's only in certain industries. So I don't know if you have Mozart or an athlete, it could make a difference, right? If you're taller, then you have higher chances of being a successful basketball player, for instance, right? And part of that is acquired. So for instance, education, experience, training, and health, right? So those are a result of going through a certain process. And that's what you're going to focus more on. So it's more about the acquired stuff. Think of these examples: athletes, artists, singers, models. So there is definitely a certain level of natural ability that these people have, right? I mean, there is a certain level of talent. You're going to have to be lucky. But there's also some acquired level. So you have to kind of foster that and develop it more and more. All right, so it could be a mix of both. If human capital goes up, then the wage rate goes up, right? In other words, if you're more able, if you can produce, if you can be more productive, then your wage is gonna be up, right? So that's the idea that you deserve it. Okay, so wage is a function of the value of the output that you generate. If the value of your output is more, then your wage is going to be more. That's the general rule, right? And you can think of that as meritocracy. Meritocracy, if you don't know what it means, go look it up. It's basically something more general, but it's the idea that, you know, the output, the results are based on the merit of the people. Okay, so there is another explanation for it, which is education as a signal. So education can increase your skills, but it could also be a signal. A college degree doesn't necessarily mean the person is more productive, but it's a sign of the person's ability to achieve and progress, right? So for instance, if you see someone with a degree, maybe they can't really be more productive than a person without it, but at least they went through a certain process. So it's meaningful. It's meaningful that this person took 4 years or whatever years to go through that process and get that degree. All right. Another example for the natural ability is, why is it that, you know, NHL and NBA players make more than local league players, right? So one reason for that could be because of the physical and the natural abilities that they have. Pause here. Another reason why wages differ is compensating differentials. And that's basically when things that are based on non-monetary aspects of a job. So for instance, consider a job which is hard or unpleasant, you know, where you have to deal with a lot of, you know, physical dirt, for instance, or which is risky and dangerous, or remote locations. All of these things are unpleasant things, and there's usually a wage premium for compensation for that, right? So because you're going through that hard part, then there is a compensation for that. So one example of that would be night shifts versus day shifts. A lot of times night shifts are paid more because of that. Now sometimes night shifts could be an advantage, and that's why some night shifts are paid less, but it really depends on how it's deemed to be. Another example of that would be a coal miner. Coal miners deal with a lot of dirt and risk, okay? So their job isn't that pleasant, it's kind of dangerous, so there has to be some compensation for that. Another example is professors are paid less than lawyers and doctors because of more satisfaction and freedom. There's a funny quote in your book in brackets, which says, wow, that's cool, which says, indeed, teaching economics is so much fun that it is surprising that economics professors are paid anything at all. Yeah, well, it is actually very fun. It's very fulfilling in a sense, right? So that could be a reason, but there's also that element of freedom. Another example is high-rise construction workers and electrical linemen. So they're exposing themselves to a lot of risk, and that could require some compensation for that. One thing here is, if you think of the wage differences between men and women, there are many reasons for them. One of the reasons is that these kinds of jobs which are hard and risky and remote places, these things are usually taken by men more than women, right? So that could be one of the reasons why there is a difference. Although the concept, the topic is very complicated, there is a lot of aspects to it. The idea of remote locations, if you think of an introvert, maybe they would actually enjoy being far away and lonely. But overall, it's deemed to be, less preferable. And sometimes that's an illusion. Sometimes you're like, oh, I would love to be alone, but then you get really bored very soon. Talking about loneliness, here's a very profound quote by Pascal. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. I just thought I'd share that with you. You don't have to take notes on it. It's quite a profound statement. You just might want to think about it a little bit. Also talking about linemen and electrical linemen and the risk they expose themselves to. Let's watch this clip.
I need to call Jenny, but I can't get a dial tone.
We're not paying our bills, so the phone company shut off our service.
Why must you fight with every utility?
I told you, I have too much time on my hands.
Homer! We were cleaning out a cooling duct at the plant and found a box of old taco shells.
Oh, why didn't you call me?
Oh, we tried, but a recording said you were a bunch of deadbeats.
That's it. They have awoken a sleeping giant.
Homer, what are you going to do?
Crazy scheme, crazy scheme, crazy scheme.
Get me tools and beer.
Yes!
Free service? Here we come. All right, let's try the red one. Okay, I'll try the green. Let's try the red one again. Not again! Let's try them together. Maybe the red one.
What an idiot. All right, so now if you notice, there was actually a couple of things here. He said, I have too much time on my hand. Too much time on my hand means that I have a very low opportunity cost. Yeah, so the idea is that if you have too much time on your hand, you would go and bargain with the phone company and whatever. And he also said they've awoken a sleeping giant. A sleeping giant or a sleeping dragon is this expression used for China and also for India, where they have a lot of resources, a lot of people, as a propelling engine for their growth. Another reason for differences in wages is this thing called the superstar phenomena. So think of some superstars like this guy or this guy. Why is it that they make a lot of money? Now there is some economic explanation for it, and that is when the product can be supplied to numerous consumers at a low cost. So you can supply a lot of people at once with very low cost. So what happens is that you can make a lot of money. So millions of people can watch Sidney Crosby and listen to Justin Bieber at once, but the best tailor or the best hairdresser can at most serve one person at once, right? So in other words, people like to watch good quality hockey. People would like to listen to good quality music. People would like to watch, I don't know, Ellen Page, for instance. And they can all do it at the same time. They can all pay for that subscription and get the service. So if you're providing such a product which can be offered to many people at once, then you can make a lot of money. Now, people also like to have the best hairdresser and the best tailor. But the thing is, the best tailor and the best hairdresser, even if they're very good in their jobs, they can't serve all people at once, right? So if you're a hairdresser, then your time is limited to that one person whom you're serving, or if you're a tailor for that matter, right? So that's why, you could be like a carpenter or a plumber, but you won't make as much money as the superstars, right? Two important elements here is that you're serving numerous consumers at a low cost. Okay, so the marginal cost is very low. So superstars get to sell more, and that creates a wage differential. So here's where things get even more interesting, the beauty premium. There was a study which found that people deemed more attractive than average earn 5% more than people of average looks. And average looking people earn 5 to 10% more than below average looking people, right? So that's called the beauty premium. Now, you have to kind of ask yourself, hang on, Does this make sense? Well, in some industries it might, but in some industries it wouldn't. So for instance, think of a financial advisor or a doctor. If you go to a doctor, would you care how attractive they are? Or would you care about their skills? Right? I mean, you would want them to cure your illness, right? Or if you go to a financial advisor, you want them to make good investment of your money. You don't care about, you know, their physical appearance. But overall there is this trend. So we have to come up with some explanations, and there are some explanations. One of them is the idea of productivity, which is applicable only to some industries, not in all industries. So that's where the workers have to present themselves to the public. So for instance, celebrities, waiters, sales agents, right? So in those industries, it makes sense that in order to sell, in order to be more profitable, then your looks do matter, right? Another explanation, which is more general, is that good looks are indirectly related to ability, right? So basically it shows their attention to details and dedication to the task at hand, right? So it kind of, it's a signal again, right? If the person has taken the time to make themselves appear properly, then that could be a sign that they are competent in other ways, right? Or think of it as some level of it is kind of logical. If you are employing a person and you have an applicant who can't even shave their face, right? How could you entrust them with the management of a company if you can't even shave your face, right? That kind of thing. But that's really the minimum. Also, in the same line, there are family issues. So employers can't ask about the family issues of their applicants, but they would like to, because that's informative. That would tell them how much, you know, they can go through different conflicts and different situations. Another reason is simply discrimination. Basically, people prefer to be around better-looking individuals, right, as their colleagues. Okay, so the employer would prefer to have a better-looking person than not. But this is only taking into account that everything else is controlled. Now here, let me open a bracket here. This idea that we like to be around better-looking individuals, this is quite profound. Notice that on a day-to-day basis, we don't get to see very old or very sick people that much. We don't see dead people around, you know, being taken to the funeral homes. They're kind of taken out of our sight. That's really because we don't like to be reminded of that stark fact that we're gonna die and that we can't overcome this, right? It's kind of a strange phenomenon that these scenes are veiled from us on a day-to-day basis, so that we are not reminded of that. Anyway, let's close the bracket. There is also discrimination in schools where attractive female students get higher marks, ceteris paribus, which actually doesn't happen in online courses where there is no physical contact. My problem with all of these is that it's very hard to measure good looks, right? It's very subjective. How do you define that, right? And also, if you get into these studies, there are always studies which claim the exact opposite. So it's always challenged, right? So there are studies which say that there is a correlation. There are studies which say that there is no correlation. Even if there is a correlation, that does not mean causality. It doesn't mean that if you make yourself beautiful, you're going to make more money. That's not necessarily true. It could be correlation, which means another reason which is responsible for both of them. Another extremely important consideration in all of these, as an economist, you should always be very sensitive about the ceteris paribus assumption, right? You can only say that beauty matters if everything else has been controlled. So there is actually a new study which found that the association between physical attractiveness and earnings largely disappears once you take into account the individual differences in terms of health, intelligence, and personality, right? So the reason why beautiful people make money is not because of their beauty, it's because of their personality and intelligence and health, okay, which is quite important. So the cause is actually different. They actually even found that in certain industries, unattractive people earn even more than attractive people. And the way I make sense of that is that to make yourself attractive, you have to invest. You have to invest in certain things, and that has opportunity cost. So if you're gonna keep that to a minimum, you could invest in other things which make you more productive. Anyway, pause here and take some notes. You don't need to take notes on the actual study, the numbers, but the overall, the three elements and some of the explanations that I gave you. Let's watch a clip which is about, wage differentials. This is a little bit disturbing because it kind of zooms on people's waists, but whatever.
What if climbing the corporate ladder meant having to lose a little weight?
I never really thought of that.
New research from the University of Florida finds that for women, corporate America is just like a catwalk. The smaller your waist, the bigger your paycheck.
Why? What difference does it make?
But if you're a man looking to snag that corner office, don't worry about skipping dessert. Thinner men actually make less money.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'll have to start eating.
According to the study, women who weighed 25 pounds less than the group norm earned about $16,000 more per year. A woman 25 pounds above the group norm earned about $14,000 less.
I'm pretty surprised. This should not be the case.
Thinner men, on the other hand, made about $9,000 less than their average male coworker. Have you noticed that?
Well, being that I'm the fattest guy in the office and I make the most.
When we took the findings to a career expert, she wasn't surprised.
I think women are judged by their appearance in the workplace. It's as simple as that. Women tend to be expected to be thinner, and men, the standards are a little more flexible for men.
They can get away with more.
They can get away with more.
Workers, however, were a little concerned.
I think that maybe if both sexes were fit, they might get paid higher, but it's a little bit puzzling to see that overweight men get paid more.
Ideally, we should be based on, our ability to perform, not, our weight.
And while our incomes may differ with size and gender, there's one thing we have in common.
I think we're all underpaid.
Discrimination is a taboo subject that everybody wants to avoid talking about, but we have to kind of have a clear definition of what do we mean by discrimination. When it comes to wages, discrimination means offering different opportunities or rewards to similar individuals not on the basis of productivity, but only due to personal characteristics such as race, sex, religion, age, and so forth, right? So anything that's not based on productivity in the labor market, that would count as discrimination. Okay, now productivity, you have to kind of expand your definition of it because it could be indirectly related. That's also okay, right? But things that have absolutely no relationship to the person's performance, then that can be problematic. All right, so here are some interesting data and disturbing also. So the average wage of female workers is about 84% of the average wage of male workers. One thing to keep in mind is that this word average kind of ruins everything because the average doesn't, you can't really make any conclusions just by knowing the average, although it's useful to have the information. Oh, that explains the difference in our wages. Yeah, that cartoon is both funny and sad. Aboriginals living off reserves, they earn about 10% less than non-Aboriginals. This is taking into account equal conditions. So equal type of job, equal level of education and experience and so forth. Okay, so you might want to take notes on some of these things that I explain as we go through this. And this is not just in wage and payoff, but also in its constituents. So such as the quantity and quality of education. So constituents means the elements that make up the wage. So for instance, you might say that, oh, you know what? These men who get paid more are more educated than women. And you might think that that's an explanation, which is an explanation, but it's not sufficient because then the question is, why is it that men are more educated than women, right? So that's the thing. You might be like, oh, Aboriginals earn less because they're less educated. But the question is, why is it that they are less educated, right? So in some disciplines, there seems to be a bias in terms of admissions, right? Admissions to the programs. And as you go higher, then that can be even more profound. The job type, that could be different. Some jobs seem to be kind of more geared towards certain type of gender or race than others. And the work experience. So for instance, promotions. In certain industries, they don't give promotions except to a certain group, right? So one example of that, it's less now, but it used to be more in finance. Finance is really dominated by white males. And sometimes it's just really on the table to just say it. They say to you that if you want to progress, if you want to, go higher and higher in the field of finance, and if you're a woman or if you're black or whatever, then you might be out of luck, right? So that could be a problem, and that's called the glass ceiling, right? You might have heard of this glass ceiling. It basically means some attitudinal or organizational bias across the board, which is not official. Nobody says it. There's no laws on it, but it's kind of like an unwritten law, right? So that's the idea of a glass ceiling. So for instance, if you're a woman or if you're black or both, then you can only progress a certain amount, right? So these things that I'm giving you, there's a lot to it. It's very complicated. We don't want to jump to conclusions, that's for sure, but it's good to be informed about what's going on, right? So pause here. So the gist of this story is that we are focusing on genders here. There is a table from your book which talks about the ratio of female to male wages by occupation. So if you look at the 84% that we had in the last slide was based on all occupations overall, but you can also look at different sectors. So for instance, if you look at teachers or if you look at clerks, the difference is much less. They make almost the same amount of money, right? If you look at the sales, for instance, then the difference is even more, right? So that's the idea here. And if you think that it's just gender, it's actually even more. It's even wider for African American and Hispanic women. This is from the States, where a Caucasian woman would earn 78%, an African American woman would earn 62% of a white male, and Hispanic would earn 54%. Now, again, these things which come out of news, you have to be very cautious about them. Usually, or almost always, they don't meet the ceteris paribus assumption, right? So this Hispanic woman, for instance, or the African American woman that they present, they don't necessarily have the same level of education and experience as their baseline for comparison, right? So you have to be very sensitive about the ceteris paribus assumption. And the reason why these studies contradict each other is because they take into account different factors. Here's another table from your book. You don't need to copy the table, this one or the last one. I just want you to know about the overall trend that's going on. And this is just gender is simple because we have only two options here. If you look at things that are more like minorities, if you think of, I don't know, homosexuals or transgenders or other ethnicities, then it can be even more complicated. So we're just looking at male, female because it's easier to classify. But the same process goes in many different ways. So here, this table explains the factors which explain the gender gap. Now, if you look at it, one major explanation is this FYFTE, which is explained at the bottom. So 10% of the wage difference is because of this. This is a full year, full-time equivalent experience. So this is really work experience. Men tend to stay in one job for longer periods of time, and you can imagine why. Another reason which explains much of the difference is the industry. So the type of jobs that we have, right? So it is, on average, the harder jobs which are more unpleasant are taken by men more than women, right? Now this table says that only about 49% of the wage differences can be explained by the factors in this table, and 51% remains unexplained, right? I have a problem with that. There is one factor which they are not taking into account here, and that is the risk of pregnancy versus long-term commitment, right? So here's the thing. If you are an employer and if you want to employ someone, you go through a lot of cost. There is an interview cost, right? That process of employing someone is costly, and you don't want to repeat it in a matter of 1 or 2 years, right? If you want to get someone, you would prefer to get someone for a long-term relationship, right? You want to have a long-term contract with the person. For that reason, if the person shows up only as a woman, just as long as they're a woman, there's a risk with them, and that the risk is that they may at some point terminate their work because of pregnancy, right? And officially they cannot kind of discriminate and say, oh, you can't become pregnant, right? I mean, that's not feasible. So what they do is that they turn it into quote-unquote discrimination, right? So there tends to be a certain reluctance to employ women in general, and especially pregnant women or women with children, because of this element. What I'm trying to say is that the employer, you have to think about the incentives of the employers, okay? they have their own incentives. It's not that they're necessarily sexist, it's just that, you know, they care about making profit, right? And if there's a risk, they would internalize that risk. And internalizing the risk means that they would turn the risk back to the applicant themselves, right? So as long as there is this natural difference in terms of bearing children between men and women, I think there's going to be some wage difference anyway, right? So there's a complication here which is beyond our social stigmas, and that's what makes things even harder to fix. All right. Anyway, there's a lot of other factors too. So you might want to pause here. You don't need to take note on everything here, but it's not a bad idea to write down a few things. So let's talk about the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors. This is the graph that you see is not from your book, but it's quite interesting. It shows a trend of how our industries have evolved over more than 100 years. Now, if you notice, what you have here is the primary, first of all, means things that relate to raw material, extraction of raw material. Secondary means manufacturing, and tertiary means services. So one thing to remember here is the difference between goods and services, right? Goods are objects, services are not tangible objects. So if you look here in the farming line, in 1891 we had over 40% of the jobs in the agricultural sector. That's what the table is saying. Over 40% of the jobs, almost half of the jobs were farming jobs, right? By 2011, it was less than 2%, right? It dropped a lot. Okay. If you look at the manufacturing, which is the secondary, it's been fairly steady. It rose a little bit during the 40s and 50s, especially with the war effort, the Second World War, and then it dropped, right? So overall, for the past 50 years, 60 years, it's been dropping again. If you look at the services, it's been rising a lot, right? So right now, it's about 80% of the jobs are in the services sector. Now, what are these service jobs? Some of these service jobs require a lot of education and training, such as being lawyers, doctors, nurses, architects, accountants, consultants, psychologists, right? And some of them don't require so much skills, like cashiers, clerks, waiters, hotel maids, flight attendants, right? Those are called MAC jobs, you know, like McDonald's jobs. So there's a mix of both of them. But basically the trend that we have is really a reflection of our ways of life. Okay, so there are some explanations here. Basically, these numbers that I'm going to give you, this is basically some reflections on how things have evolved. So one of the ideas here is that the jobs in agriculture and manufacturing sectors have decreased because of higher productivity, which means that the same output can be produced with fewer workers. So it doesn't mean that we are producing less wheat. It just means that we need less farmers to produce the same amount of wheat. We are actually producing a lot more wheat, and the same can be said about manufacturing. All right. So overall, unpleasant blue-collar jobs have decreased, and pleasant white-collar jobs have increased. Right. So that's kind of like the trend overall about what's been going on. So this is not a bad thing. Having more services, having people more in the services sector is not a bad thing, because those jobs are usually more pleasant. So basically, some people say that, oh no, all of the jobs are being converted to MAC jobs, and MAC jobs are not stable, and they're not good, and they're not, you know, high quality and all that. And the answer is that no, that's not true. First of all, tertiary jobs are not all MAC jobs. A lot of them are professional jobs, and also this evolution of the sectors is actually good for us. It shows that we are improving. So one reason why this has happened is because of demand. People's incomes have increased in the past 150 years a lot, right? So as people's income increases, people spend a smaller ratio of their income on basic needs and more on higher needs, right? So basic needs are things like food and manufacturing products, right? So the first two types. And higher needs are things that are usually or predominantly met by services, right? This is based on the American psychologist Abraham Maslow, who had a hierarchy of needs, which is quite interesting. Basically, you have certain needs that are needs for survival, and those are predominantly provided for by goods, and then you have higher needs like psychological needs and self-fulfillment needs, which are provided for through services. The standard of living has increased because of services, mostly. All right. So for instance, think of telecommunications, which has evolved a lot in the past 50 years. Think of transportation, the modes of different different types of transportation, the entertainment industry, healthcare, financial services, and safety. Most of these have increased a lot because of our services. So instead of needing so much of the basic needs, we are spending a lot more on things that are higher in our hierarchy. A lot of the products that we have today didn't exist before, and many of them that did exist were not available at this level of quality. So overall, there has been a lot of improvement in the standard of living. And here we reach the end of this series of videos on microeconomics. Congratulations for finishing the course. One of my pleasures in life is to have that personal relationship with the students in the class. With these videos, I've deprived myself of that. Oh no, what have I done? But I only did that because I was convinced that it's effective for your learning. So if you felt engaged, if you felt like you learned something that's useful for you, then that's my reward. Basically, at the core of economics is this idea of rationality, and that's something that you want to take out of the course. Basically, the point of all this mess is to be able to look at things as an economist. And an economist thinking, what it means is that you look at the incentives of the people in any decision that they make without any value judgments. So look at the people, how they behave, all of the decisions that are made. Why is it that they make these decisions, right? Looking at the incentives involved, really. That's something to take out of the course. I want to thank you all for the effort that you put into the course. I was impressed, over the past 15 weeks, all of the good notes that you took, putting up with my lame jokes, all of the hard work. Excellent job. I also hope that you realize the amount of work that was put in making these videos. Each video of about 30 minutes took about 12 hours for me to make. I literally spent all my vacation making it, and I'm proud of it because I think it's useful for your learning. So yeah, anyway, wish you the best. Farewell, my dears.